Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us. It would be great if you put actually in the chat box where you are connecting from. Welcome to the second workshop of the second chapter of the course on why have trade unions organized historically. Thank you very much for joining us, and we are really happy to have with us today Professor Rick Halpern from the University of Toronto, Canada, speaking to us and discussing with us the very interesting case study of the meatpacking workers organizing in the early part of the 1900s. Rick, thanks a lot for making time for this workshop, and perhaps we go straight to the topic, picking up on one of the points that you make early on in your video lecture. What can trade union and labor activists that are trying to organize in the conditions today about in a context of all sorts of divisions, nationality, gender, race, and so on, learn from this very important story that you brought for us in this very interesting video lecture?
Well, great. Thank you for that question. And thanks for involving me in this project. It's a real honor to be involved, and it's really great to be here this morning. So let me start by trying to answer the question with some very broad brushstrokes. What does the case study of the packing house workers in the United States tell us about strategies for organizing today? I think there are 3 or 4 points to underscore, to emphasize, to get our discussion going. The first is that classes are internally divided, always. This has much to do with the way capitalism works. It's combined and uneven development. And I think it's fair to say that workers, certainly in the contemporary world, tend to be more divided than bosses, more divided than capital. But these divisions aren't natural. They arise out of the way capitalism works, but they're manipulated. They're utilized by employers, by capital, sometimes to divide workers. And we saw that in the case of the packing house workers in the early 20th century. But those divisions are often also used by capital to keep wages low, to keep conditions inside of workplaces less than ideal, and of course, to play one group off of another. So capital is always manipulating these divisions and these instances of inequality that are caused by capitalism itself. The other point that I would make, and again, painting in very broad brushstrokes, and we can come back and look at some of the specifics. But my next point would be that solidarity is a project. And what I mean by that is it's not enough simply to appeal for working class unity or to appeal to workers to come together across lines of skill, of gender, of race and ethnicity. You need to make that part of the everyday work of the union, whether that's talking to workers outside the plant or on the shop floor, whether it's the activities of the union. And you need to be aware of the history of the industry and the history of the working people who make that industry operate. The next point I would make, I think, follows on from this one. If solidarity is a project, organizers need to recognize difference. And what I mean by that is need to understand that different members, different workers come from different historical backgrounds. There are sharp differences in the way in which they've found their way to the workplace. And again, if we use the example of packing house workers in the first few decades of the 20th century in the United States, perhaps the sharpest difference that's important to recognize is that For many white immigrant workers from Eastern Europe or even from the British Isles, the process of proletarianization, the process of becoming an industrial worker, a packing house worker, represented a bit of downward mobility, maybe loss of skill. In the case of some immigrants, loss of the ability to look after one's family by growing crops, being connected to the land, certainly loss of autonomy. But for African American workers in the packing houses of the United States in the early 20th century, rather than representing a downward kind of mobility, packing house work represented an extraordinary upward opportunity, the ability to escape the segregated and violent South, the ability to earn wages, probably for the first time in their lives, because they moved from a system of sharecropping where they were paid not in wages, but in kind. That means paid not with money, but with food and supplies. And certainly the opportunities for advancement for African Americans in the packing houses of Chicago and Kansas City and East St. Louis were extraordinary compared to other African Americans making that same journey and unable to find industrial work. So there are important differences both in this process of class formation, but also in experience. I think one of the reasons that the United Packing House workers were able to succeed in overcoming a long legacy of fragmentation was they were able to speak to those differences. They were able to understand that solidarity was a project, and they were able to bring workers together on the basis of difference, rather than appealing to them as some kind of mythical proletariat that needed to come together. And this leads me to the final point that I'd like to make to kick off our discussion this morning. When we look at the experience of the packing house workers in the 20th century, we see that over a number of decades, the union was able to deliver not just better wages and working conditions, it was able to deliver not just what in the United States they might call a middle class kind of existence, but was able to make a material difference for those workers who were struggling against specific forms of oppression. In terms of African American workers, it advanced a struggle for civil rights decades before the civil rights movement of Dr. Martin Luther King burst onto the scene in the late 50s and early 1960s. For women workers, the UPWA, the United Packing House Workers, was able to open up employment opportunities in some of the higher paid, the better skilled, the cleaner departments. For Latino workers as well, the packing house workers were able not just to fight discrimination in the community, but open up employment gains in the plant. And I think they were able to do this because the union itself was constantly in struggle. The union itself was constantly engaged in fighting the employers, but also fighting discrimination in the community. And I would call this social unionism. And I would use that label to differentiate unions like the United Packing House Workers, certainly from the mainstream of the American labor movement, which tended to focus entirely on wages and benefits and not really focus on workers' lives when they left the plant, workers' lives when they went back to the communities that they were from. There was a saying in the American labor movement that's very apt here, or at least the left wing of the American labor movement. We want bread, but we want roses too. And I think that very much characterized the social unionism of the United Packing House Workers. So hopefully with those broad brushstrokes, I've given you some food for thought, enough material to ask some follow-up questions, but I'm certainly willing to field just about any comment or question that you might have.
Thanks so much, Rick, for this very, very helpful insights into the case study and how it relates to the big questions that activists are facing today when it comes to organizing workers and all the sorts of divisions. And the point that those divisions have always existed. So there is really no point in complaining much how extraordinary our times are, because the times of organizing have always been exceptional. But we open up for questions or comments, and please do take the floor and tell us where you're from. Alternatively, you can also put in the chat box, especially for comrades that are coming from that have problems with the language. Please, we have people here to help with Spanish, so you can also type in Spanish, and then we can have it translated. So who would like to take the floor first? Don't be shy. Yes, Brian.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Rick. I'm Brian from the Philippines, but I'm currently based in uh, Pennsylvania. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. So when I was reflecting on the question that I will ask you, I realized it's one of the questions in the exercise. So, uh, s- I'm thinking about the role of the political action of unions, especially during the FDR period, during the New Deal period. So the question in the exercise is worded like it implies that there's a debate whether like industrial action is a cause or effect of labor policies during that time. So can you reflect on this, maybe particularly in the meatpacking session, whether they have influenced some of these policies, or and in general whether influencing policy is a union objective rather than waiting for progressive policies as opportunities. I think you have talked about this in your opening remarks about social unionism, but maybe expand on political unionism, something like that. Thank you.
Yeah. It's a very good question, and I think it gets us to the heart of a really important debate, not just in the 1930s when Roosevelt's New Deal really reshaped the political landscape of the United States, but it's also an ongoing question. There are those who feel that for unions to place too much emphasis on politics is a diversion from the real focus, which has to be on organizing workers at the point of production. But I think the larger lesson of the packing house workers as a case study is that these two struggles are joined, and at different moments, different conjunctures, one side or the other becomes prominent. And let me try and give you one or two examples to make that clear from the case study. Certainly, when Franklin Roosevelt came into office, there was an unusual situation given the utter collapse of the American economy. And it was a moment when it seemed that capitalism had spent its force. There were various other ideas and visions in play for how an economy might function. And what I think labor historians tend to forget is one of the most compelling visions was profoundly anti-democratic. And that was the vision of fascist Italy, fascist Germany, and by the end of the 1930s, fascist Spain. It seemed to be a controlled economy that was delivering a modicum of relief with regards to things like unemployment and so on. And Roosevelt's mission, in many ways, was to restore capitalism. But it was the intervention of the industrial union movement that made sure that the reforms that Roosevelt put in place to save capitalism were going to produce a more democratic form of capitalism, a social democracy, if you will. And I might add here that it's, I think, very interesting and important that the United States gets its welfare state and gets its social democracy in the 1930s. as opposed to much of Europe, and particularly Northern Europe, that came after World War II. And I think that helps explain the more limited nature of American social democracy. In the middle of the 1930s, Roosevelt faces re-election, and faces re-election in 1936 at a moment when business is back on its feet, is beginning to organize to limit the New Deal economic reforms. And that election of 1936 is actually a landslide victory for Roosevelt and the Democrats. And in many ways, it's a landslide victory because labor mobilizes behind the Democratic Party through something called Labor's Nonpartisan League, which is a creation of the newly formed CIO. By the way, it's ironic that it's called nonpartisan, Labor's Nonpartisan League, because it's entirely partisan. It's entirely designed to elect progressive Democrats. In certain locales, this landslide produced what looked like labor parties. You're zooming in from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is probably the best example of 1936 CIO-backed Democratic Party forming essentially a labor party in the state of Pennsylvania, particularly the western part of the state in the steel producing areas around Pittsburgh and the Monongahela Valley. But let me use one other example that I think is really important in the history of the packing house workers as well, and kind of points in the other direction. The period after World War II is a pretty tumultuous one for the American labor movement. There are a number, in almost every industry we look at, there are a number of strikes and confrontations with employers. Packing house workers fight two titanic battles. One in 1946, which ends in victory and significant improvement, both materially in their contracts, but also in terms of the willingness of the union to engage in progressive civil rights and community-based activity. And this fuels a 1948 conflict. And the packing house workers are the very first large industrial union to go out in a nationwide strike when a piece of repressive labor legislation has been passed, the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act, which makes unions liable for damages, even financial damages that the employer might incur. It provides local and state authorities with the ability to use police forces to crack down on union picket activity. And crucially, the Taft-Hartley Act requires unions to have all of their officers sign affidavits that they are not communists, not on the left. So this is a turning point in the politics of the United States. And it's really the beginning of a Cold War within the labor movement. The packing house workers go out in violation of the Taft-Hartley Act. They refuse to sign the anti-communist affidavits. They employ the same mass tactics that they have employed successfully earlier in the post-war period and in the 1930s. And the debates within the union's executive board during this strike are very revealing, because many of the officers argue that to give in to the Taft-Hartley Act, to give in to the provisions, not just the non-communist provisions, but the ability to force things like arbitration and government intervention, would ultimately undo the union, would ultimately be a setback and take power away from workers on the shop floor, and instead place that power at the highest levels of the union bureaucracy and the state. And that's what keeps them out on the streets in violation, fighting the employers and also fighting the state and the Taft-Hartley Act in 1948. Now, although they ultimately lose that strike, and it is a very serious defeat, the experience of opposing the state and realizing that the way forward for their style of social unionism is to preserve power in workers' hands shapes their experience all through the late 40s, the 1950s, and even into the early 1960s, which is the final period of the UPWA. So my point here is that politics are always important, particularly in a situation where the state has a monopoly on police and state violence. And unions, in the case of the UPWA is very clear here, need to carefully navigate the field between economic activity and politics. And so the middle 1930s and the late 1940s are two completely different political realities, which push the UPWA, but other CIO unions to adopt very, very different strategies about how they're going to engage in politics and confront the state. In one case, in the 1930s, the state is an ally. In another case, in the late 1940s, the state really is an enemy of the union movement.
Thanks very much, Rick, and very, very interesting also, I suppose, for our comrades organizing in increasing authoritarian societies such as Argentina, for instance, in terms of the strategy of actually, facing such developments. Is there another question? I know, Gifford, you had put one. Yes, please. You had put one in the registration link, so perhaps you just make your question here.
It's a different question. Thanks. I live in San Francisco, where kind of, the ILWU, the longshore workers, kind of weathered that kind of Cold War storm along with the United Electrical better than most, and they're remaining, and both I think are independent to this day. That got in and out of the AFL-CIO. But my question is a little bit about that. How did the packing house workers weather that loyalty oath from that? Because 10 unions got kicked out in like 49 and 1950. And the only two that remain are the United Electrical and the LWU. That's one part of it. But also, I was really interested in your presentation, the ruralization, when they took closed packing houses in the urban centers of St. Louis, or Kansas City, excuse me, Chicago, East St. Louis, and then went rural. Was that an attempt to break the union?
Yeah. Okay, these are two really great questions. I'll handle the first one first. When you look at most of the expelled unions, there were rival unions that stayed within the CIO that were able to raid those locals and pull them in. So for instance, Mine Mill is expelled for being communist dominated, and the United Steelworkers immediately begin raiding Mine Mill facilities. And by raiding, I mean they go in, they organize, they have an election. They often run on very demagogic anti-communist platforms, and they're able to pull those workers out of Mine Mill into United Steelworkers, remain in the CIO. You mentioned the UE. Well, there's a rival union, the IUE, and so it goes. In meatpacking, there was not a rival union. And that's one reason why the CIO is reluctant to expel the UPWA, even though plenty of the top officers were on the left. Two other factors, though, play in here. One, in the wake of this 1948 strike, the strike defeat, the most visible communist leader, Herbert March, who is the director of District 1, which includes Chicago, does resign. It's an interesting dynamic because he's immediately hired by his own local, Armor 347, and really continues to be a force within the district. But technically, he's resigned. And the president of the union, Ralph Hellstein, who'd never been a production worker, social democrat from the Midwest, a lawyer by training, Certainly a fellow traveler of the left, is not a card-carrying member of the CPUSA. So in that sense, UPWA's political complexion looks a little bit different than the expelled unions. It looks more like a union that's willing to tolerate various forms of left-wing leadership, not just communist, but Trotskyist, socialist as well. And so that's another reason that they're not actually expelled. Third point on your first question, I think a real litmus test for the CIO as it moved into anti-communist Cold War phase was whether a union supported the third-party candidacy of Henry Wallace in the Progressive Party in 1948. Wallace runs on a program of extending the New Deal, of peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, the wartime ally of the United States. And almost every single one of the expelled CIO unions officially throws their weight behind Wallace, not just at the top of the ticket, but also backs the Progressive Party down the ballot in terms of local and statewide struggles. Packing house workers, again, are a very, very broad church, if you will. They allow individual local unions to decide whether they're going to back the Progressive Party, whether they're going to back the Democrats, and the union itself, in a very savvy fashion, walks a tightrope between support for Truman and the Democratic Party and support for Wallace and the progressives. So that's I think the third reason that it manages to avoid expulsion. So Gifford, to turn to your second question, the ruralization of packing house work. The short answer is yes, this is in many ways an attempt to escape a high-wage, militant, unionized workforce in the urban centers where stockyards historically were located. And you mentioned a few of them, Chicago, Kansas City, East St. Louis, but we could go on here and look at places that also, smaller packing centers that also saw plants shut down and relocate really to the hinterlands. Fort Worth, Sioux City, in fact, Sioux City in Iowa is an agro-industrial urban complex that sees not just packing house work, but all sorts of work disappear in the early 1960s and move to more rural areas. But, and I think this is an important but, it's not simply an anti-union strategy. It's also a strategy that wants to take advantage of new technologies that will allow for further de-skilling of workers and an expansion of the employer's profit margins. If you think of the old style packing houses located in Chicago and elsewhere, they were multi-story buildings where animals were driven up a ramp to the very top floor. And on the theory that gravity is free, you'd have the killing floors on the top, and then the product would make its way all the way down to the bottom where it would be shipped out by rail. The new packing houses in tiny towns in Iowa and Nebraska were single-story horizontal structures where the moving assembly line, which existed on the top floors, the killing floors of the old packing houses, now extended through the entire plant. And the use of automated knives, they were air-powered, called whizzer knives, and other new forms of technology allowed for much faster throughput of material and allowed the new packing companies to hire, I won't say unskilled, but marginally skilled farm boys, farm women to perform labor that was much more routinized. So there's a combination here of an effort to escape the high-wage unionized workforce in urban centers and take advantage of new technologies. And the final point I'll make here is, of course, this meant that the plants were closer to the point of livestock production, to the points where sheep, beef, pork were raised. So they saved enormous amounts of money on the initial transportation costs. They didn't have to worry about getting those animals from rural Nebraska to Omaha, or from rural Iowa to Sioux City, or to Chicago. And increasingly, a integrated highway network of that supported refrigerated trucks replaced rail as a way of transporting the cut meat. But thanks for both of those questions.
Thank you very much, Rick. Any other question from the comrades? I haven't seen in the chat box. We had a comment from our comrade from Peru about the situation.
Yes, I'm reading that now.
Of course, you're free to comment, Rick.
Yeah. I mean, I'm often struck as a labor historian who focuses on the United States, and to a much lesser extent, some comparative work in other countries, how relatively privileged American unions have been throughout the 20th century, in that they operated in a relatively open and democratic environment. And when you compare this to the working classes of other cities who faced enormous state repression and operated in the face of dictatorships, the contrast is really quite dramatic. But it's interesting how workers develop tactics that allow them to advance their struggles, but also to protect themselves. Give you one example here from US labor history. One of the most effective tactics in the early 1930s was a sit-down strike, first pioneered by auto workers in Flint, Michigan, but then adopted very widely by workers in other industries. So at the same time that auto workers were sitting down inside the auto plants in Ohio and Michigan, the first major packing house recognition strike took place in the tiny town of Austin, Minnesota. And workers also know that even though it's a socialist governor, he's going to call out the National Guard. He's going to use military force to police the strike and maybe break it. So they actually occupy the plant. And by going into the plant, they know that the hand of the state is going to be stayed, because to fight workers inside the plant, there's a chance that machinery will be damaged, the plant itself could be ruined. And this tactic is both a defensive one, in that workers are protecting themselves from the constabulary, but it also significantly advances the struggle and becomes a characteristic of the CIO's focus on production, that to occupy the plant, to control the point of production to the point where you're not just simply stopping the assembly of automobiles or the slaughtering of meat, but you're actually occupying the plant, is a pretty radical move, and inspires workers, across the country. So I think that's an interesting development, and up to that point really had not been employed by American workers. There's also a sense that workers believe the plant is theirs as much as it belongs to the employers. And there's some wonderful photographic material from these sit-down strikes. If I could just share one example from an oral history interview. At about this time, the Kansas City armor plant in meatpacking is occupied. And the occupation stretches on for quite a while. And what the workers do to entertain themselves is they have musical concerts each night. And they use the largest room in the plant, which is at the very bottom level, the hide cellar. And in oral history interviews, 30, 40 years after the event, you have workers saying how interesting it was for them to hear different ethnic groups and different racial groups perform the music from their own cultures. And it's unfortunate that this was never recorded in any way. There is a remarkable film about miners by John Sayles called Matewan, Matewan, in which there's a romantic depiction of this sort of intermingling of musical cultures, where the miners are all locked out and it's evening and they have campfires, and you first hear a group of Italians with an accordion and singing play their song. And then you have a group of African Americans responding to that in a kind of blues idiom. And then you have Polish workers as well. Now, this is a movie. Luckily, it's not Hollywood. It's not that bad. It's a very romantic rendition, but it's a romance that emerges from a very real reality of industrial unionism in the 1930s, when workers who might come together in the plant had very little understanding of each other's cultures. And I think one of the accomplishments of the industrial union movement, not just the UPWA, but the CIO as a whole, was it began to educate workers about the different historical experiences that had brought them together, brought them to the United States, to the industrial North in the 1930s. I see there's new messages in the chat.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks a lot, Rick. Rick, if we can pick up a bit also on what you were just saying now about this oral world history interview, but also the discussion we had just before our workshop about the topic of intersectionality. Because it seems in this case, it was intersectionality in action, even without using the term. So if you can expand a bit on that, because it's a debate that is following us in the different conversations, and perhaps you can put that in the context of this case study.
Right. So I'm glad that you said that the term intersectionality is not one that would have been floating around in the 1930s or 40s or 50s. It's a contemporary term. But I think that organizers in the 1930s understood intersectionality, even if they didn't have that piece of vocabulary. That is, they understood that class was always experienced in different ways by different kinds of workers. So when approaching women workers in the packing houses, organizers understood that there were certain women's issues. I'll even call them feminist issues. Again, that's a term that would not have been used in the 1930s, that were paramount in the minds of those women working in departments like oleomargarine, sliced bacon, lard, and to get them to come over and join the CIO, join the UPWA, you had to understand what their challenges were, what their grievances were. And for many of these women workers, the big challenges were the rest of the plant tended to operate on an hourly wage. In these female-dominated departments, there was piecework. So the employers had women compete with each other to try to produce as much as possible, and they'd be rewarded monetarily the more they produced. And the women wanted this practice stopped. They felt it was demeaning. It certainly was exhausting. And the union responded and picked up this demand. And it's different in different companies. But by World War II period, by the 1940s, this sort of competition through piecework is largely eliminated, not entirely, but largely eliminated. Another really important grievance that women workers had was the way the seniority system operated when it first came in. Women could gain seniority in their own department, but were not able to use that seniority to move up into other jobs that were higher paying and would involve training and the acquisition of new skills. Again, by the World War II period, there's plant-wide seniority rather than departmental seniority. This is the UPWA responding to the very specific challenges that women workers faced. Let's use one other example here. Class is also raced. In other words, class is experienced through the lens of gender. It's also experienced through race as well. And I've alluded to this earlier in the presentation when I pointed out that for most African American workers, the process of proletarianization involved upward social and economic mobility as opposed to most white ethnic workers. But when organizers spoke to Black workers and asked, what are your grievances? Many times those grievances took root and form outside of the workplace. They had to do, for instance, with the journey from segregated African American neighborhoods to the packing houses, which were located beyond an Irish American neighborhood in the midst of an East European neighborhood. And these Black workers often were subject to violence on their journey to work, sometimes subject to taunting and stone throwing on the part of children or teenagers, and sometimes subject to much more serious forms of violence. So what the union begins to do is have groups of union members meet African American workers where they get off of the elevated train line and walk with them through the neighborhoods that they needed to pass through to get to the packing houses. Now, think about this for a moment. Not only is this addressing a grievance and offering protection, it's providing a visible example to the entire community of Black and white unity as essentially they're parading daily through contested geographic terrain. In much the same way, many of the bars and taverns surrounding the packing houses were integrated by packing house unionists so that after work, Black and white workers, Black, Latino, and white workers could go together, not just to enjoy a beer, but could talk about the organizing campaign, could strategize together. And in this way, I think it's important to realize that organizers understood intersectionality, even if they didn't have the vocabulary of intersectionality.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
I think that's a topic that is going to accompany us.
Yeah. There's two really interesting questions here that I'd like to address from the chat. The first one is from Monroe in Bangladesh. And the question is, what is the collective bargaining situation and mechanism in America? Have any strikes held last 5 years? How do trade unions organize strikes? So I think this is a really great question because there are some parallels to what's happening now in the United States to what was happening in the early 1930s. So when the CIO first emerges in the early 1930s, so back to those sit-down strikes that I referenced, the big unions that represent auto workers and packing house workers and electrical and steel workers didn't exist. This was truly working class self-activity, and it owed very little, if anything, to the organized labor movement at the time. In fact, the organized labor movement at the time was really simply what was called the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. There was no CIO. And the AFL focused its attention on skilled white male workers. In fact, when organizing first began, the AFL dismissed this organizing, and the famous words of Daniel Tobin, president of the Teamsters, riffraff at labor's back door. But other labor leaders realized that there was something very dynamic about this organizing. And the key figures who formed the CIO break away from the organized labor movement. This would be John L. Lewis of the mine workers, David Dubinsky from the garment workers, and create the Congress of Industrial Organizations. But my key point here is that they were like surfboard riders who learned to ride a wave. The power and the motion was with the working class. The genius of Lewis and Dubinsky and Hillman was to channel this movement, this dynamism, into a very dynamic labor movement and to connect it to Roosevelt's New Deal. So if we go back to the United States today, I think we see something very, very similar, where there's a lot of organizing going on in unexpected quarters. Starbucks, fast food, Amazon. And at first, the organizing that took place was independent of the AFL-CIO. Amazon Workers United, Starbucks Workers United, Amazon Labor Union. These were only loosely connected to the organized labor movement. What's happened in the last 3-4 years is organized labor has begun to understand that this is an opportunity, and has begun to shift resources over to these organizations. So there's a certain parallel here where dynamic organizing takes place outside of the official labor movement, and labor movement then struggles to catch up and to respond. There is one huge difference, though, between the early 1930s and the United States today. Today in the United States, workers still operate within an industrial relations system established during the New Deal in the 1930s. There is a National Labor Relations Board that oversees union elections, that has the ability to declare certain employer activities, such as intimidation, firing of activists, to be illegal. And again, I think this shows how politics really matters at certain times. I don't want to divert our discussion into the election that's taking place in 2 weeks in the United States. But for labor, this is an incredible crossroads, because it's pretty clear that if the Democrats lose the White House, this system of industrial relations, which has been in place since the mid-1930s, will be dismantled. But there are some very interesting parallels with the 1930s.
Thanks. And there is a question from Gifford.
Yes, about the 1984 Killing Floor. Okay. So this is a really interesting film made by a talented filmmaker named Elsa Rossbach. And it focuses on Chicago in that 1917 to 1921 period. So it actually is remarkably accurate. Rossbach had a team of researchers go into the archives and do really a remarkable job trying to recreate actual historical figures. And the two key protagonists in the film, Frank Custer and Heavy Williams, Austin Heavy Williams, are actually based on real African Americans who migrated to Chicago from the Deep South during World War I and found jobs in packing houses. And the film also very accurately understands and depicts the way in which the July 1919 race riot dooms the organizing drive, splits black and white workers, but plants the seed for the later triumph of the UPWA. There is a recording made about a year and a half ago by the Labor and Working Class History Association that is a symposium very much like this one on Zoom about the film, and I can send along a link to that. We were very fortunate to have the filmmaker join us for that symposium. And it was a very lively evening. It followed a showing of the film. So I'll make sure that you get that URL and you can distribute that.
Thanks for that. Okay, so there are a few comments. Okay, there is a hilarious comment that we should all be voting in the US elections, given
Yes.
the impact it has in the world.
Yeah.
And then the one in the movie, that's fine. I don't know, is there another question? If not, I'm going to abuse again the role of the moderator for two questions, Rick. I mean, the first is, if I understand correctly, the meat packers tried to organize in the 1970s. That ended up badly, even with more polarization. But they continued organizing and agitation in 1920s, even without any result, because we see the results much later, which somehow it's quite inspiring, because we see often a bit of frustration saying, oh, we tried for a year to organize this group of workers, it didn't work, and then you say it doesn't work. But in this case, we see how they are organizing for over a decade without any obvious result, but perhaps I'm wrong. That's what I understand from the video, until the time comes that certain conditions come together, that you have this explosion, if you like, of the meatpacking unit. So if you can speak a bit to that, to the importance of this continuous organizing, like not like with campaign style or organizing campaigns, but really sustained organizing over time. And the second question I have is, you also make the important point of the union moving beyond craft unionism and trying to change structure to also respond to the reality. And I think it echoes also questions we are having in our own network about this continuous process of union adaptation to the conditions outside. Meaning we will not see the end of unions per se, we may be seeing the end of a particular type of union, but then there would always be worker organizing in union. So if you could perhaps speak to those questions, and we're also approaching the end of the workshop, but yes.
This period of clandestine or underground organizing in the 1920s is a fascinating one. And it's one that we as historians have only been able to get at through two interesting types of sources. One is oral history interviews, really done in the 1980s with elderly men and women who were in the plants and active in the 1920s. And the other set of sources have been the reports of spies, either of company spies or of government spies trying to keep an eye on radicals within the industry. And what's interesting to me is that when the 1921 strike ends in an unmitigated, complete defeat for the union, hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of workers are fired and blacklisted and told they're never going to work again in the industry. Many of them leave the industry and go do other things. But there are others, particularly skilled workers, skilled butchers, who leave the large packing houses in Chicago and Kansas City and go to smaller towns and ply their trade. And because of their skill, they're able to get jobs on the animal killing floors, and they work and they make a living. But they also carry forward the idea that workers should organize. Maybe only organize to protect themselves, to control the pace of the line. Maybe organize not to form a union, but to get a degree of dignity and respect from the foreman. And by the time the 1930s come and the New Deal is in place and workers are organizing, these are not newcomers. These are no longer outsiders. They're fellow workers who've been showing up day in and day out, doing their job, quietly talking about the importance of collective action. And now's their moment to come forward and say, okay, we're going to join the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee, or in some cases, it has a different name, the Packing House Workers Industrial Union, or the United Union of All Workers. And they're respected partly because of their skill as butchers, and partly because of the leadership they provided in a very quiet way over the course of a decade or more. Often these are called boomer butchers. Boomer meaning in American vernacular language, boomer refers to someone who's itinerant, who travels around. And also in the early 1930s, before unions emerge in the open, these boomers are augmented by left-wing activists. They could be Trotskyists, they could be communists who get jobs in the plants. The difference is they tend not to be packing house workers, not to be butchers. They're not skilled, but they have different kind of knowledge, tactical knowledge, and of course they have connections with workers in other cities. They have the ability to draw on other resources. Maybe it's the Communist Party of the United States. Maybe it's the Socialist Workers' Party. And so you have inside the plants a really interesting synthesis, if you will, between these sort of indigenous traditions of craft radicalism based on ideas about workers' control and dignity, and these left-wing activists. If I could push this even further, I'd call it a synthesis between an indigenous tradition and the kind of the best of Leninism as a kind of organizing current. And that bears fruit in the 1930s, a very, very unique period. Could you repeat the second question for me?
Yeah, the second question was about, you make a point how the union emerges also to overcome the craft unionism to become an industrial.
Yeah, right. Different forms.
Different forms to respond to the reality.
Yeah. So craft unionism certainly was outdated by the 1930s. It emerged in the 19th century in response to industries where skilled workers still controlled the production process. And its strategy was to control access to jobs and drive wages up. By the early 20th century, corporations were the rule. Mass production, whether it be automobiles or electrical appliances or meat, was the norm, and craft unionism was obsolete. And industrial unionism had been around for a while, but had never been a dominant form of organizing. The mine workers were a long-time proponent of industrial unionism, organize all workers in a mining complex, regardless of their skill level. The IWW and the Knights of Labor in the American context also argued that industrial unionism was the way forward. So this always represented a struggle in the end of the 19th and into the first few decades of the 20th century, but craft unionism was dominant until the emergence of the CIO. In the 1970s and 80s, American industrial unions fall on hard times because of the globalization of basic industry. And we saw at that point grasping efforts to experiment with new forms of organization that crossed national borders. There were some instances of success. I think chemical workers were among the few that were able to do this. But it didn't really replace the industrial union model. So to go back to the point that you made when you first framed the question, workers' struggles continue and are always seeking ways to adapt to the structures of industry and of capital. But they tend to lag behind. And while I'm not going to predict the future in any way, that's not my job, I think what the past tells us is we should not be too closely wedded to certain forms of organization, and we need to think creatively and flexibly about novel forms of organization that allow workers in different locations to coordinate their struggles.
Well, thank you very much for the very fascinating discussion and inspiring messages, Rick. I think we've come to a close. Thank you everyone for the questions. We continue our series of the workshops. Please do make sure to watch the video lecture before we start the workshop.